All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight for this very important information session to learn more about the proposed 2023 municipal budget. My name is Sasha Novak, and I will be your moderator for this information session. I want to start by thanking Mayor Paul Lefebvre for joining us this evening, along with Deb McIntosh, Councillor for Ward 9 and Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee, and Vern Cormier, Councillor for Ward 10 and Vice Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee. Each will be available during the question and answer period following the presentations. I also want to take a minute to introduce our executive leadership team and budget staff here with us. They will also be on hand to answer your questions about the budget and budget process. Ed Archer, Chief Administrative Officer, Kevin Folk, General Manager of Corporate Services, Steve Jakes, General Manager of Community Development, Joseph Nichols, General Manager of Community Safety, Tony Cicutti, General Manager of Growth and Infrastructure, Ian Wood, Executive Director, Strategic Initiatives, Communications and Citizen Services, Marie L'Italian, Director of Communications and Engagement, Meredith Armstrong, Director of Economic Development. Tonight's session will begin with presentations, which will last approximately 30 minutes, followed by an hour-long question and answer period. We will be taking questions tonight through the Q&A tool you see on your screen. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the evening using that tool. As a follow-up, we will be publishing your questions with the answers on our Over to You engagement platform in the coming days. As well, we are keeping the Q&A tool open on Over to You and will continue to accept and answer questions until February 15th. This session is being held via Zoom and is being recorded. It will later be available on the city's 2023 budget project page on overtoyou.greatersudbury.ca. Closed captioning is an option. You can go to live transcript to turn it on and off. All right, let's begin with opening remarks from Mayor Lefebvre. Mayor.
Thank you for the introduction and for being our moderator this evening, Sasha. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples of the Robinson-Huron Treaty, traditionally shared by the people of the Atikosheng Anishinaabe, Wahnapitae First Nation, and Sagamok Anishinaabe, encompassed by the Robinson-Huron Treaty. We honor and respect these Indigenous people as the ancestors and traditional stewards of the land upon which we stand today. May our relationships with the land teach us to live and work in good relationship with one another. I look forward to a good review of the budget and to hearing the questions that residents have regarding the 2023 budget. I want to thank Councillor McIntosh, the Chair of the Finance Committee, as well as Councillor Vern Cormier, the Vice Chair, and the Administrative Committee, as well as Ed Archer, Kevin Folk, Meredith Armstrong, Steve Jakes, Ian Woods, Marie L'Italian, for providing their perspectives and taking questions this evening, as well as Tony Cicutti. And I also want to thank the finance team for the great work and all the good work that goes into putting together a budget. There are also councillors that are on the call this evening, and I'm sure they're like me, looking forward to hearing their questions. So finally, I want to thank you, the residents of Greater Sudbury, for joining us tonight and being engaged in the process. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, and I'm looking forward to see this, my first budget of the as a mayor of the city of Greater Sudbury. So thank you for that. Over to you, back to you, Sasha.
All right, thank you, Mayor Lefebvre. Now we will hear from Deb McIntosh, Councillor for Ward 9 and Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee. She will introduce the 2023 proposed municipal budget. That will be followed by a presentation from Mr. Archer and Mr. Folk. Sorry, Councillor McIntosh, you're on mute.
And I did really well. I was really speaking very well. Okay, sorry about that. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Sasha and Mayor Lefebvre. I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight to learn more about the city's 2023 draft budget and to ask questions. Our annual budget is the city's yearly plan to pay for the services we deliver and the buildings, pipes, and roads that support those services. Every year, Council provides staff with a direction on producing a budget that is fiscally responsible and provides residents with the services they've come to rely on, all while keeping an eye on what we want our city to look like in 5, 10, and 20 years from now. This year, Council directed staff to develop a draft budget that was no more than a 3.7% increase from 2022. We also asked our service partners to follow the same guideline. Our service partners are organizations funded partly by municipal taxes, but controlled by separate boards of directors. They include the Greater Sudbury Police Services, the Greater Sudbury Public Library, Conservation Sudbury, Public Health Sudbury and Districts, and the Sudbury Airport. City staff have developed a proposed budget that aligns with Council's direction and strategic priorities. These priorities include a high level of service delivery, planning, building, and maintaining sustainable buildings, roads, and pipes, responding to climate change. Council's priorities also include making strategic investments that foster economic growth and development, ensuring safe, affordable housing for all residents, and making Greater Sudbury a healthy and vibrant community to live, work, play, and invest. The proposed 2023 budget looks to achieve these priorities through sustainable investments in roads, facilities, and community services. These investments are made through the operating budget, the money for day-to-day services like parks, police, and plowing, and the capital budget, the money for investments in roads, buildings, and pipes. Every year, Council receives feedback from public engagement where you tell us what's important to you. This year, you told us that winter maintenance and road maintenance and construction were your top priorities. Of the proposed capital budget of $155 million, nearly 1/3, or 51 million, are dedicated to road work. You also told us that water and wastewater, emergency services, garbage, and recycling were important to you. And you'll see in the proposed 2023 budget that the capital budget supports asset renewal in these areas as well. Your input is important to the budget process. Tonight, you have the opportunity to hear a presentation on the proposed budget and ask questions. We will also be hosting another session like this next Monday, February the 6th from 6 to 8 p.m. Council will begin budget deliberations on February 15th. Until that time, we on Council are reading the 624-page document and asking questions that are being answered by staff and representatives of outside boards. We encourage you to review these questions and answers, which are all published along with the 624-page budget document on the city's website at greatersudbury.ca/budget. With that, I will turn it over to Ed Archer, our Chief Administrative Officer, and Kevin Folk, our General Manager of Corporate Services, to share with you a presentation on the proposed budget for our community. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor McIntosh. Mayor Lefebvre, Councillor Cormier, and members of Council joining the call. Thank you for making the time. I also thank my executive team colleagues and our finance staff who've joined us this evening to support the process that we're going through. This is a team effort, and we're all working towards a shared set of objectives that the 2023 budget really defines in ways that lead to specific choices about service levels and the types of services that the community will receive from the municipality. As a single tier municipality, we are the one location for all local government services in this city. That means we have responsibility, as Councillor McIntosh was just describing, for an array of services. And the important thing to remember about that is that while we may not individually use all of those services, we use quite a few of them day to day, and we may not even recognize it. They're all, however, important to someone in the community. And the choices that get made through this budget process are important, not just for the costs that are incurred as a consequence of those service decisions, but also for the effects they have on the lifestyles and the capacity of our businesses to perform at the levels that they want to meet their goals. So we recognize the important responsibilities we have through this process. And that's why you have a 600+ page document to review and opportunities for engagement like this, because we recognize that the choices are important and have consequences far beyond the decisions of just how much they cost and how to pay for them. But those themselves are important elements. So we appreciate the opportunity to share details tonight with you and address any questions you have. And with that, I'll ask for some assistance in getting the presentation up on the screen that you can see. And we'll begin an overview of our 2023 proposed budget. So Important to remember that staff's responsibility here is to provide council with our best advice about how to navigate the series of expectations it has for services to the community. Council's decision and responsibility is to make decisions about what those proposals look like. So we've developed, based on guidance council gave us at the beginning of this process last summer, a set of service plans that, subject to this review process, will be decided by council and then become our business plan for the year. The services are what drive our costs. So between Mr. Folk and myself, we'll describe a little bit about what's influencing those recommendations. And then, of course, some details about what council will consider later this month as we prepare the final steps of our budget development process. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, Councillor McIntosh just walked you through a few of these numbers. These are the highlights, and from a top line perspective, show an organization that has quite a significant influence on the quality of life in the community. Just judging from the numbers you see here, the day-to-day services that Councillor McIntosh referred to have a total operating budget of $700 million. That includes the municipally provided services and those provided by the service partner that Councillor McIntosh described. The capital budget, the infrastructure, the pipes and the roads that go into our day-to-day service delivery and support services over the long term have a $155 million budget associated with them this year. A significant portion of that, the largest by far, is dedicated to roads and our road network. Now, we also have water and wastewater services. So for those in the community who rely on city-provided water or wastewater services, there's a separate budget for that service because it is a self-funded service. It doesn't require any tax subsidy, but it is nonetheless part of the service package that council considers in this proposed plan. And it has a total cost of $94 million. And it follows a separate long-range financial plan that we are provincially required to manage and to keep up to date. And it anticipates that there will be a 4.8% change in the rates that are associated with that service to keep it a self-funded and self-sustaining entity. There are, of course, to get to a 3.7% tax change, a series of issues that we navigate to address the headwinds and the unique factors influencing the costs associated with our services each year. And this year was no different. There were many significant challenges, and we'll briefly describe some of those. But the plan, is important to recall, is one that maintains the services and the service levels that we've traditionally provided in the community and still makes important investments in the infrastructure that will help facilitate economic growth, improve the quality of life for the residents who rely on our services, and provide some long-term opportunities for developing further quality of life opportunities and business opportunities down the road. Can I have the next slide, please? So all of these plans, of course, are just that. They're plans. They're proposals for how service can be delivered. And municipalities cannot run an operating deficit. That is, the money that we spend to provide services needs to be supported by revenues of an equal amount. We have to have a balanced budget. And so these influencing factors that affect our plans have a lot of influence over how and how much service can be provided in any year. For example, as we all know from day-to-day lifestyle choices that we make, just grocery shopping, for example, inflation is a significant issue. And in the context of the businesses that we're in, inflation has an outsized impact on the total cost of our service plans. So this is particularly relevant when we talk about our infrastructure planning and developing or improving our assets. There we have inflation factors that reflect the costs of limited construction material supply, the costs of limited labor availability, and the disruption that's been caused by supply chains across the globe, all contributing to increased costs for elements of materials and supplies that we use to sustain our assets. And those together played a significant role in overall cost increases that we had to manage to develop the plan that council asked us to provide. There are, of course, for some of our services, increased demands. So we are not in the business of making a profit. We supply services at a cost that we measure against our peer municipalities and ensure that we are delivering according to council's budget so that we can demonstrate accountability and demonstrate that we are following whatever best practices are available to ensure that value for money is available. But when there is a growing demand for the service, therefore, the cost of the service also goes up. We have some new services that are part of this proposed plan that were introduced in 2021 in response to, at least in part, some of our COVID experience. And that reflects the support for supervised consumption and transitional housing support services. Now, those are, again, part of a draft plan. Council will decide whether those services continue to be funded as part of a taxpayer-supported service. They are, from our perspective, healthcare services, and those are traditionally provincially funded. So there may be changes there that with support from the province, taxpayers won't have to provide the costs for. Then there are legislative changes that the province or the federal government directs municipalities to apply to their programs that also have an influence on our costs. And the most recent one we've discussed, and one that has significant influence, is related to the province's Bill 23 legislation, the More Homes Built Faster Act. That's changed a variety of things in the way our planning services work, but it's also changed the way we pay for some of the infrastructure costs associated with growing our community. Previously, some of those costs have been able to be funded by what's called development charges instead of taxpayer support. And that reflects the idea that growth pays for itself. Some of those legislative changes have created a situation where now some of those costs must be provided by taxpayers. And for illustration, in our 2023 plan, that translates into development charges that are approximately $1 million lower than they were in 2022. So those costs still need to be incurred, and the costs are supported in the proposed plan by the property tax levy, because the legislative changes have made it impossible for us to collect development charge revenues instead. Can I have the next slide, please? So in all of those descriptions, what we initially started with to maintain services and service levels was a projection that showed an unacceptably high level of tax change, a 9.3% change. And council, to no one's surprise, I think, anticipated that we should be following our long-range financial plan, which we've been publishing for several years now and maintaining, which anticipated a change in the tax levy of 3.7%. That meant we had to find $17.8 million in adjustments, either new revenues or lower costs, to maintain a plan that followed council's direction. Now, as Councillor McIntosh described, our service partners are part of this effort, and we collaborate over several months to build this plan in concert with them. And in January, as the police board is responsible for doing, it approved the police services budget at a level that was slightly higher than the initial projections we've been working with anticipated. And so there's some additional adjustments required to bring the whole plan in line with 3.7% budget direction. The draft plan includes proposals for council's consideration that does just that. But again, those are separate decisions the council will make as part of their deliberations later this month to facilitate the 3.7% direction and address some additional service changes that would be required to fulfill that goal. If they choose to take other decisions in those deliberations, then we'll do some analysis and facilitate amendments to the plan to address where they think some other adjustments can be made to support getting the result they need to match both service expectations with the costs that they're willing to fund with the property tax levy. Can I have the next slide, please? To bring the plan into a state where it met council's directions, we made a variety of adjustments. And so I described just a few minutes ago the influence of inflation on our capital plan. That was a significant factor because construction materials costs and labor supply costs have gone up a lot over just the last 12 months. Now they've started to normalize. Nonetheless, they are still significantly higher than our traditional levels of change would indicate. And so our capital budget, while it's gone up, has been adjusted from where we started in June downward to reflect a lower increase in those projected costs. So that means the capital plan is slightly smaller than it might have otherwise been, but for those inflation factors. We've also identified a need through the operating budget review to introduce a process called vacancy, we're calling vacancy management. It's really recognizing that when positions become vacant due to things like retirements or resignations, the time required to fill the position with the successor for the role takes time. And in our routine processes, that's typically a 4 to 6 week period. What we're going to do to keep the budget within the guideline that Council asked us to follow in 2023 is keep those positions open slightly longer until we get to the point where we have a $3.7 million adjustment, or sorry, $2.7 million adjustment to our vacancy management budget so that we can ensure the overall costs of the plan meet Council's expectations. That means there will be some service impacts across the organization. We don't know yet where they are, but we are anticipating that through maintaining those vacancies for just a little bit longer, the overall effects on service will be relatively small, but at least manageable. We've also increased our investment income budget. So the costs that we are incurring on our construction projects is having a beneficial effect on our investment portfolio because interest rates going up are creating new revenue opportunities for us with our investments. And that's recognized in this increased investment revenue line. We also have, as part of our long-range plan, intentions to increase our reserve balances. Reserves are funds anticipated to be used in a future period to mitigate the risks that come up when assets fail unexpectedly, or there are new opportunities for funding from senior governments that we'd like to take advantage of that we didn't budget for. And reserves help manage those opportunities in a smooth way without disrupting other services. Our reserve levels in Greater Sudbury are relatively low compared to other municipalities and compared to those that are providing services like the ones we do. And our long-range financial plan anticipates that we will take steps to strengthen those reserves. This plan proposes pushing those plans down the road a little bit in favor of maintaining a level of affordability that Council is comfortable with. Similarly, we've made other adjustments to reserves to, for example, at our 199 Larch property, to reduce the frequency with which we contribute funds to sustain that building's condition. And we will manage our operating and maintenance plans accordingly to avoid the potential for, or at least minimize the potential for, a critical asset failure. And you see here, we've made other adjustments in specific line items throughout the budget to bring the overall costs of the proposed plan in line with Council's budget directions. And so we've identified how to address the $17.8 million worth of adjustments needed. And it is now for Council's review to assess whether those adjustments are reasonable or whether there are some other adjustments they'd like us to make instead. And that's what we will discuss over the course of the next several weeks and at their meetings at the end of the month. Can I have the next slide, please? So this picture simply illustrates at a very high level where the funds that we're talking about are being distributed to support the services that are provided on a day-to-day basis. And you see here that in this illustration, the Greater Sudbury Police Service is the largest single cost element of our service plans. There are, however, of course, several others like fire services, social services, paramedics, and road construction that together make up the bulk of our spending plans. We are in over 50 lines of service. These service descriptions capture at a very high level the basket of services that we provide each year. But the costs for each of those are pretty well distributed, as you can see here, except for a few categories where, from a community safety perspective or from a road construction and maintenance perspective, there are a lot of services that are important to someone that have a relatively small share of our overall costs. Can I have the next slide, please? And together, as I mentioned off the top, we benchmark our services and we measure our performance to see where there are opportunities for process improvement or to ensure that we have what we consider to be a best practice approach to demonstrate both accountability and an efficient operation. And this picture illustrates that relative to our peer municipalities, that is communities with more than 100,000 population across the province, the property taxes that are applied to homes here are among the lowest in the province. This comparison assumes a same size property with same house, just simply translated into each of those communities using the tax rates in effect in those communities and their assessed values, because the assessed value of that same house will change depending on which community it's in. So a standard house on a standard property facilitates this kind of comparison. On that basis, you see Greater Sudbury's property taxes are among the lowest. Can I have the next slide, please? I'll ask Mr. Folk to describe some of the details that cover the elements of our draft operating and capital budgets. These next few slides offer some illustration of how the plans come together. So Mr. Folk, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Archer. This next slide isn't certainly all of the costs that we're talking about changing in this year's budget, but are provided for, their budgetary significance in one way. And just because those that are joining us this evening would understand, inflation is a significant impact on this year's budget, and it is in every year's budget, but I would suggest a more significant influence in the 2023 budget than perhaps in the last 25 to 30 years. Looking at the inflation numbers from December over December of last year, sitting at 6.3%. Understanding too that a basket of goods that a municipality needs to provide services is generally 1% to 2% more or higher than the All Canada Price Index for an average household. These examples of fuel and diesel, which of course the city uses a lot of in provision of services, are examples. We've budgeted at a combined rate, for interest's sake, of $1.50 a liter for those. We know from driving around that gasoline certainly is maybe a little bit lower than that right now, but diesel, which comprises about 70 to 72% of our fuel costs, certainly not down to that level even at this point. You can see here utilities, which I think everybody, our house utilities, bills, natural gas, hydro, and water, significant increase for this year. Natural gas in particular, insurance costs, and even sand and salt. So an increased budget there of $536,000. So provided as illustrations, but certainly, for those of us that are running a household budget, very, very similar to the kinds of expenses that we're seeing rising more so this year and over the past 18 months or so than they have in a very long time. Next slide, please. So Mr. Archer's described earlier some of the larger budget changes that were made to arrive at a budget net change within Finance and Administration Committee's guidance. The changes on this slide were arrived at by a variety of different initiatives that staff have undertaken over the course of 2022 and in preparing our budget for this year. Job combinations, taking advantage of enabling technology, assessing changes in our regulatory environment that have allowed for reductions in planned expenditures or increased revenues. I always look at and spend some time on the table of staffing changes, which we've summarized in page 70 of this year's budget document. And so, as has been pointed out earlier in the presentation, our entire 600 and some odd page budget document is online, and we're seeking your input and commentary on that document. In page 70, you'll see the puts and takes of the numbers of employees that we have in the organization, and it gives you a sense of the ongoing collaboration that takes place throughout the year as vacancies arise, in which priorities are examined, resources are pooled, and made to cover emerging, planned, or strategic priorities as we go. And so, that's reflected in pooling here of administrative resources, some savings in moving services to a one-stop services approach here at Tom Davies Square. For those of you that have seen the new, relatively new one-stop services counter on the first floor here. Credit and debit card transactions. So again, a regulatory change that allows for some convenience on the one hand through a number of new customer service initiatives that we've undertaken, but allows for the charging of a small fee for those related transactions. And I'd point to Compass, which gives us new opportunities for process reviewing and workload management in the manner that I'm describing here. Compass stands for Comprehensive Organizational Management Productivity Activity and Service System. And the data that it provides will provide an understanding of the service outcomes associated literally with every minute of staff time, and will help us better match service expectations with the resources required to produce them and ensure our resources are properly deployed to address the city's and the council's highest priorities. Next slide, please. So the capital budget, so flipping a little bit from the ongoing operating expenditures to provide programs and services to the capital budget, it's comprised of approximately 155 million in new and prior approved projects. These are investments that City Council makes to sustain service levels now and into the future. They include spending on physical structures and underground infrastructure that support city services, things like buildings, roads, pipes in the ground, playground fixtures, equipment, vehicles like buses and snowplows. The investments we're recommending complete work on prior capital budget priorities, but we've also prioritized roughly 68 million in new capital projects that are high priorities because they address a strategic objective. They lessen some risk that we won't be able to provide service at some point throughout 2023. They capitalize on funding opportunities or synergies with other planned projects. So for example, where we're replacing a road and there are wastewater mains and lines that need to be replaced while we're doing that. All of which are aligned with our enterprise asset management plan and our plans for the various asset categories in the plan. Council will receive an update on our asset management planning at its meeting on February the 7th, next Tuesday. And there's an excellent report there with report cards on each asset class, the level of investment that we're putting into each asset class, and in most cases, a gap in terms of the amount of investment that might be required to sustain those assets at the level of service that they're providing today. And so that gap means that there is a scarcity here in terms of the amount of money that we're putting towards investments in maintenance and infrastructure for city services. It means that there are choices to be made. And so we've provided a committee with the prioritization that you see here on the slide, and it will certainly be to committee to debate and to discuss priorities for each asset class in the capital budget portion of their deliberations. The next slide, please. So here are just the sources for the capital funding plan. The budget doesn't anticipate any new external debt in 2023. The funding from the capital program, as you'll see here, is comprised mainly of the annual contributions to capital in the budget. So the amount that's set aside each year as we go to budget. So it comes from the operating budget, if you want to look at it that way, into capital to be invested in infrastructure. The next is user fees, which is comprised, pardon the pun, in the main of water and wastewater user fees, but also other user fee supported services like leisure services, environmental service fees, parking fees that you would pay towards upgrade and maintenance of parking lots, and finally grants from senior orders of government. So these are all detailed in total and by project in the capital budget section of the budget document. And we provide a 5-year look too at next priorities in terms of a 5-year capital plan. The next slide, please. So roughly, as Mr. Archer has indicated, a third of these projects are road projects. Among the new capital project priorities are bundles, though, too, of library, leisure service, and emergency services facility upgrades and equipment, and repairs which, if approved, will be planned and commence in 2023 and completed in 2024 and 25. These include, for example, 4 arena roof replacements. A quarter of planned expenditure is funded by the water wastewater rate budget and is comprised of projects on, as you'd assume, water and wastewater treatment facilities, pipes in the ground that either collect or distribute flows across the community. The next slide, please. So on November 30th, Council directed 45 business cases to be published for consideration during budget deliberations. Business cases are either new programs, changes to services, one-time capital and or investment expenditures that are raised during the budget process for committee to consider as a part of our planning for 2023. Most arise from service level needs identified in 2022 that were guided by the former council into this year's process. A set of these business cases, if approved, comprise service adjustments equal to approximately $1.4 million that could either be used to reduce the net levy or could be considered in whole or in part to fund other desired service changes which would add to the net tax levy. And so they are, if you will, savings that could be, if they were accepted as business cases and adopted by committee, used to defray costs and reduce the overall tax levy, or allow for the incorporation of some of these other business cases or some of these other initiatives to be included in the overall 2023 budget. Next slide, please. The water wastewater budget, as Mr. Archer has pointed out, is 100% user pay. And so unlike the municipal tax levy, it's applied to all properties across the community. The water and wastewater services are paid for by roughly 48,000 of our 70,000 residents and businesses, based on the size of the service, usually a pipe into their property, the actual amount of water consumption, and a surcharge based on that consumption to cover wastewater expenditures. Water and wastewater services are really highly regulated. And so when it comes to this asset class, they have to be fully funded or sustainably funded such that the amount of rate that's being recuperated in any given year covers not just the operations of the water system, but also future capital investments, replacements, in fact, of the assets that are used to provide those services. And so the rate increase that is in the budget for 2023 is 4.8%, consistent with the mandatory long-term financial plan that the province demands in order for us to have a drinking water license, incorporates all of those costs and is followed from year to year in terms of it. Next slide, please. The service partners that are on this slide are not all funded directly by the tax levy. The Greater Sudbury Airport, as an example, is entirely self-funded, relies on some services from the city, which are provided via an operating agreement. But generally speaking, the revenues and the expenditures are balanced by the airport board and do not put pressure on the tax levy that we're discussing this evening. Conservation Sudbury is established as a partner under the Conservation Authorities Act. It's primarily funded by an operating grant from the city. Public Health Sudbury districts have proposed a budget that calls for a 3.2% increase over its 2022 grant of just over $8 million. Greater Sudbury Police Services has the largest budget among our service partners at roughly $73 million and are funded almost exclusively from the tax levy. And finally, the Greater Sudbury Public Library, the roughly $10 million budget, is also, as you can see on the slide, mainly funded by the tax levy. The next slide, please. And so, Sasha, I'll hand the rest of the agenda over to you now. I believe Councillor McIntosh has handled all of these details. Council and the committee are now, or as this evening, reviewing the proposed budget. We've started this process at the Finance and Committee, the budget meeting of January the 17th. Deliberations will continue again starting on the 15th and 16th of February and into early March if necessary. And then council decisions will be made and finalized in early March to constitute the plan and the budget for 2023.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Folk, Mr. Archer, as well, Councillor McIntosh. That concludes the presentation. The session is now open for questions. A reminder to submit your questions, go to the Q&A tool on your screen. Please don't use the chat. It makes it easier for us to follow the questions if you use the Q&A tool. So our first one, why do we have reserves? If we have them, why aren't we using them to reduce the tax levy?
Well, thanks for the question. That's a good one. Reserves are, as Mr. Folk described, funds set aside for future opportunities or to address the unexpected expenditures that might occur from time to time. Like, for example, when an asset fails, think of a water main break or a road that needs some emergency repair or a facility that needs some equipment replaced because it's failed and the operation can't continue without it. So reserves provide flexibility really. They are there because in the absence of reserves, municipalities, remember, have relatively few ways to earn the money needed to support the services. There's property taxes. There's funding from senior governments. So the province or the federal government will provide funding from time to time for usually specific things. Rarely are the funding that the province or the federal government provides shared with us without qualification, and typically it's attached to a specific project. And so reserves give us flexibility that takes advantage of those funding opportunities when they arise, but it also offers protection. Reserves offer protection against those unanticipated expenditures, and they offer as well an alternative to debt financing. So if we didn't have reserves, we would only be able to raise money for the work we needed to do through property tax, or hoping that the federal provincial government would provide some funds for us, or by charging user fees. And so if you go to a rec center to use the pool or to participate in a recreation program, you typically have a fee that you pay. That's a part of the overall cost of providing that pool service or those recreation programs. And those revenue streams don't make up for the kinds of revenue requirements we might have when an asset fails or the federal government or provincial government offers funding to us in return for us contributing a share of the overall project's cost they're helping us to pay for. Reserves fill that gap. So it's an important part of a municipality's financial plan, and our reserve levels are relatively low. Nevertheless, I mentioned we have a long-range financial plan, and that anticipates we will be building our reserve balances over time. We have a 10-year planning horizon in our long-range financial plan. And so gradually we anticipate building our reserve balances to support taking advantage of those provincial or federal funding opportunities, and to address, as Mr. Folk described, our asset renewal needs as well, and avoid as much as we can the use of debt financing or making big annual changes in the overall tax levy requirement. So we wouldn't use reserves to reduce the tax levy, because a fundamental principle of our planning approach says ongoing costs need to be supported by ongoing revenues. That just is a good, prudent approach and avoids the risk that you run out of funding before you run out of service obligation. And no one wants that, because then it leads to either a significant change in service or a significant change in one of those other revenue streams, different user fees or different property tax levy levels. Reserves help us smooth those things out and avoid any kinds of unintended surprises that are caused by asset failures or opportunities to grow the community through collaborating with the provincial and federal government. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. Next question. What efforts are being made to hold the provincial government accountable when it comes to the sharing of mining royalties? Past PC platforms for the North have included this commitment, but it seems there has been no action from the city. Are we to sit and wait, or is there a plan rather to be proactive and chase what is rightfully ours?
Thank you for the question. Certainly, mining royalties is an area of provincial responsibility. Municipalities don't really have significant influence over the distribution of mining royalties. That's a provincial revenue stream, and it's provincially managed. Now, I will note, and Mayor Lefebvre may want to offer some perspective on the collaboration and engagement he's undertaking since being elected with our provincial colleagues. But the provincial government in its last mandate introduced an opportunity for revenue sharing with northern municipalities. That was a relatively modest amount attributable to Greater Sudbury, but one that nonetheless was paid out by the province in its last term. But we are, through our relationships with both provincial and federal government, anticipating that the benefits we get from being the global mining hub, really, for particularly mining supply and services, but with the number of active mines here, a significant force in the global economy from a mining perspective, ensuring that we're working as closely as we can with both the province and the federal government to take full advantage of our strengths. And that includes capitalizing on the economic development opportunities that exist by virtue of our location. Mayor Lefebvre, not to put you on the spot, is there anything further you'd like to contribute to that response?
Thanks, Ed. Certainly, that's last 2 months that I've been in the position. That's something I've been working hard on. Certainly, as Ed mentioned, you can look at it as the revenue stream from the royalties that has been collected by the provincial government from the mining companies. And Sudbury is a bit unique in the sense that we have 9 operating mines in our city. And there's not a lot of municipalities in Ontario that has any operating mines. Maybe Timmins, Kirkland Lake come to mind, but so we're in a unique position. And certainly those are conversations that I have had and I will continue to have with the provincial government to try to advocate to see how that translates on the supports that we should have, and how do we transfer some of those royalties and in what form that can take. Now, that being said, we have an amazing opportunity, I believe, certainly as the world is changing upon us, that the electrification of our world and certainly the critical minerals that we have here in the basin, we have richness, the likes of which are not seen across the country. So we have a unique opportunity, and we need to work hand in hand with the province to see what the potential where that lies. We're obviously the mining hub, as we're saying, when it comes to supply and the services. So that's the equipment and the manufacturing. How do we do more with that? How do we attract more of those businesses to create those jobs, that bring people here, to expand our tax base? So those are things that I'm focused on and I've been working on for the past 2 months, and hopefully down the road there'll be a lot more to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you both. This next question is regarding the relationship between library and city. I understand that the library is asking to have a $10 million operating budget approved. In reviewing the operation budget, does the city consider the number of users? Do we know how many people within CGS have used the library's services in the last year? I realize funding decisions cannot be based on usage only, but I think the number of citizens that benefit from a tax expenditure should be one of the metrics for approval. My question is, what percentage of Sudburyans use our library services in the last year?
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for your interest in participating tonight. The rate of participation from the library services is one that we'll certainly have to follow up with our CEO at the library to get the specific details about. But I'll mention a couple of things to provide some perspective, perhaps, to your thinking about this. The library services provide a community benefit that goes, like many of our services, frankly, provide a community benefit that goes beyond the individuals who attend the service and then use the library either for the books that are provided there or the maker space or the events that they host. And the benefits to the community, really, while they may be intangible, are nonetheless real. And ones that are an influence in the choices that the board and council, in turn approving the board's request for a budget, consider when making their decisions. And so the library has, an outsized influence on the community's overall quality of life. And I can tell you that, and I will confirm the details with Mr. Harding, the CEO. There's over a third of the community who are active users of the library. But beyond that, there are elements of the library service that contribute to our overall quality of life that we have to consider. Now, we do benchmark our library services with other communities across the province. In fact, across the country. We're part of a network of municipalities that have decided to share information using a standard format. And library services are one of those things that we share details about and measure our performance collectively over. And so if you go to nbncanada.ca, you will see a report there describing the latest availables for 2021, the information that compares Greater Sudbury Library Services with others across the country. Most of those communities that we're comparing with are in Ontario, but you see examples from Western Canada as well. And you see there that service levels, notwithstanding perceptions that may be available about what the cost of service are, are in line with those that are provided in other communities. And so the service is there for us to use. The choice to use it is an individual one, but the availability of the service and how much is there is something that the library board and council consider as part of the budget review process. If we were to apply the metric of putting, how many users are using the service for any of our municipal services, we'd be particularly sensitive to the risk of marginalizing members of the community, where, as I mentioned off the top, none of us use all of the services we provide, but everybody uses some of them. And for some of those services that don't get a lot of use, they're nonetheless fundamentally important for the people who do use them. And so I appreciate the perspective. This is certainly about dollars and cents, but the budget process is also about first services and what kind of community do we want to be. And in that context, the answer to your question gets a little more subjective. Nevertheless, I appreciate the question. We'll follow up with our library folks and get the most recent usage data and put it up on our website so that we can refer to it from now on and through the rest of this process. Oh, and Ms. L'Italien has something to add. Thanks, Marie. Over to you.
I just want to add that every week the Q&A that is posted on our website, which is councillor questions to finance staff and to city staff about different subjects, is posted on the website and on Over to You. And there are some questions from last week's package that do relate to the library, and there are a few usage numbers in there, Ed. I don't know if they're all in there, if all those questions are answered. So that information can be found there as well if anyone's interested in checking that out.
All right, thank you both. How do you decide how much user fees are going to be?
Thank you for the question. We have a policy that describes the expectations for user fees, but ultimately council decides what the fees would be. I'll ask Mr. Folk to describe the approach we've taken to and the advice we gave council a couple of years ago now about how to assess what an appropriate user fee looks like. Mr. Folk, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. There is a great graphic at page 522 of this year's document, but I always credit Marissa from our communications group because she did an excellent job. The little graphic shows a number of people standing there, and the signs they're carrying say who benefits and who pays. And I think it's a really eloquent way of describing the framework that council accepted and adopted a number of years ago for pricing services that are not solely on the tax levy and may either be partially subject to a fee or in whole subject to user fees. And so we've set up 4 different classifications of fees. Either a service that's being provided provides benefit to a large group of the community. So think of street lighting, or think of mainly the roads network. There are services that provide benefits to the entire community, and it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to go collecting a fee for those things. A second category could be those that are primarily community benefit related, but have some level of individual benefit. So for instance, a bus fare. There's a lot of benefits to having a fully functioning transit system that can substitute for the use of individuals driving to work or to school or to play in a vehicle. So there is a societal or an overall general community benefit to a good transit system, but there is an individual benefit as well, and in terms of enjoying a ride on the bus when needed. The next category is less community benefit and primarily individual benefit. So for example, fitness fees. It's great to have people that are fit in the community, and it saves a number of other costs, potentially follow on to senior orders of government in particular, but the fitness fee is one that is probably going to recuperate more of the overall cost of providing fitness services because it's a fairly individual thing, down to a purely individual benefit. So think of a private swimming lesson, trailer parks as an example too. There's some benefit there to providing a recreation service, but by and large, the slip or the lot that's being leased out by a family for a given period of time for a vacation is a pretty individual benefit. And so those categories inform whether a service ends up being funded strictly by the tax levy and is shared by all of us, over to the other extreme where it's clearly an individual benefit. And there are percentages, and you could calculate putting a percentage to an individual benefit covering all of its direct costs, and in some cases, even the future costs of providing that service. So if it's a fitness facility, might not just be the cost of the heat and the hydro and the staff at the fitness facility, it would be the equipment that we know we're going to need to replace that's going to wear out at that fitness facility, and perhaps even the facility or a portion of the cost of the facility itself, because it is providing that level of individual benefit. And so you'll see, again, I point you to page 522 because I just love the graphic. It's all about who benefits and who pays. And that it provides a great description of the framework that we use to price services, if there are new ones, and how we advance fees in terms of their increases from year to year. By bylaw, we do provide across the board increases to services as well, in accordance with the Consumer Price Index in Canada. And so by bylaw, there are a number of services that will increase each year. But then when new services are coming online, or if we're making changes to fees at all, we make them in the direction of the framework. We're not at 100% implementation of a framework that has all of, for example, the fitness costs or all of the individual services priced with all of their capital needs moving forward on 100% on a fee. We're moving some in the direction of those numbers. I would point out too, as Mr. Archer has pointed out, there are some services that the city is better able to provide than even the private sector. And perhaps in the private sector, the service wouldn't even be provided if it wasn't for the access that certain city services provide. I think of pools as perhaps a primary example of that. Arenas is another one that has, quite a bit of a fee that's paid, by the users of the service. But private pools and private arenas, as an example, are difficult businesses to make profitable for individual investors. And so there is a role for government, local government, to create some of and sustain some of those services, charging for the societal benefit, all of us a little bit, and then charging a fee for those individuals that are using, and the proportion at which we sort of gauge where the benefit is falling. So that's a little bit on the user fee framework. Certainly more information in your budget document for this year.
All right, thank you. This next one is related to the police budget, and it's a few questions in one. So just let me know if you need me to repeat, please. How does deliberation of the police budget work? If council does not support the budget because they feel it's too high, does it just go back to the board to come back with another option? And does it keep going back and forth? If so, how does that affect deliberation timelines?
Thanks for the question. So as we described earlier this evening, the police service is funded by mainly property taxes, but it is governed by a separate board. So council's role in the police budget process is slightly different than the one that they use for determining the municipal services that we've been discussing that are directly controlled by council. In the police service example, council's role is to simply approve or not approve the requested police budget from the board. The chief presents the board with a budget that it deliberates, it considers and reviews, and if it's approved, it's presented to council, and council then considers the funding request. If council wants to reject the funding request, it can do so, and typically the practice would be to send the budget back to the board for further consideration. And the board may decide at that point to make some adjustments because typically council would provide some feedback that would give the board a little bit of focus around what particularly council found difficult to accept in the submitted budget. If the board, however, is comfortable that the budget it submitted is the right one, then it would come back to council with a response that said, we like this budget, we think it's worth approving, and then council has a choice. And if it wants to reject that budget still, there's a third-party process that's managed by the province that would get involved and basically deliberate with the police board and the council a discussion that would lead to a decision about what the budget will ultimately look like. And so council would then abide by that third party's decision, as would the board. But that's a rare circumstance. Typically, the dialogue that exists between the board and council is sufficient to get enough understanding between the two groups about the priorities that are trying to be addressed with the budget and the considerations that council is making when it's considering its funding requests, to have a meeting of the minds and some consensus about what an appropriate police service budget looks like. But if there needed to be, the province has a mechanism in place to support some third-party support to get that resolution. Typically, though, experience shows that councils and police boards find their way pretty clearly on a bottom line to on their own without getting the province involved.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. Is there any chance of the city moving to multi-year budgeting?
Thanks for the question. Yes, and in fact, if you look at our budget today, our capital budget illustrates some features of multi-year budgeting, because our budgeting policies anticipate for our infrastructure projects, particularly the ones that last or take several years to complete. When council approves those projects, they're approving the funding required for this upcoming year, but they're also approving the funding in those future years to make sure that that project can be completed. Now, we've discussed over the last term with council the potential to do something similar in our operating budget. And you see many examples across the country of communities that have 2 or even 4-year operating budgets. And each year then, once those budgets are set, council reviews them on an annual basis. But the anticipation is they're using a longer planning horizon. And so our council has expressed an interest in developing a similar multi-year approach here. We would anticipate probably a 2-year approach. But I'll ask our chair of finance, Councillor McIntosh, for some perspective on whether or not there's particular interest among these new councillors and the ones re-elected to see that timeline accelerated. But I can anticipate we'll have some further discussions this term about the benefits of moving to a multi-year budget here in Greater Sudbury. Councillor McIntosh.
Thank you. I can't speak for all of council, this is not a conversation we've had with our new members at all, but the fact is council has to be looking forward and looking to the future and making decisions today that benefit tomorrow and the number of years going forward. And we're often looking further down the road when we're making our decisions. Sometimes it's hard to understand why we're doing that, but I think that a multi-year budget would be beneficial as well. So often we're having to go back over the same things is not a really great use of time. But the looking longer term in the investments we're making would be a much forward-looking and more effective, I think, in the use of our time, in the use of our resources, if we look further down the road rather than just 1 year at a time. Nobody does that in their real life. We're all saving for retirement right now, or they're saving for something we want to do, saving for a house, saving to buy a car, whatever. We're looking long term in our own lives. Well, a city doesn't have an end date. A city goes on forever, so we have to plan for that. We have to think that way. That's the mindset that we should have as a council. So I'm really hopeful that in the next coming years we will be able to move towards multi-year budgeting. Thank you.
Thank you all. The next question, what does other include in the list of services and percentages allocated in the presentation?
Thank you for the question. And I'll ask for an assist from Mr. Folk. But in general, I mentioned that we're in over 50 lines of service. And so depending on how you want to break that list down, other can be a few more categories, or it can be several dozen more categories. But Mr. Folk, I'll ask for the purposes of tonight's discussion and the presentation we use for just a quick breakdown of what we included in that presentation.
You're on mute, Mr. Folk.
Sorry. Yes, I'm just calling back up the presentation here so I can get to the slide. Maybe if we can, if there's another question, it might just be easier to go to that. And then
yes,
I could,
absolutely.
Are we speaking about the, I guess I'd also want to clarify, are we speaking about the budget itself or the slide that we've provided in terms of the ways in which we achieved the 3.7% net budget directed by committee? And maybe I wasn't listening close enough to the question.
Yes, I will get that answer for you for sure. The next question in the meantime is permanent funding for the supervised consumption site in the budget?
Thank you for the question. So I would avoid calling any of the funding that we use in our operating budget permanent funding. It's subject to regular review and change. But to answer, I think, the intent of the question, the base operating budget, the expenditures that we anticipate reflect the services that we've delivered in 2022 coming into 23, includes funding for supervised consumption and our transitional housing services. So in the context of the directions council gave us, and in 2022, those services were funded with temporary funding. The anticipation was that they would continue into 2023, subject to council's review of the budget. And so considering the competing demands that exist for limited tax dollars, there could be a change. And like I said earlier, the province may come through with some funding to reflect support for what we see fundamentally. And I think there's general agreement about being public health services. So right now, the operating budget includes funds to support those services. That's subject to further review by council. And it could change either because council wants it to, or because the province has come through with some funding that would allow us to redirect or reduce overall municipal spending.
All right, thank you. I'll repeat the question that we had initially. What does other include in the list of services and percentages allocated in the presentation? And this does refer to the slide that broke down the services like transit, police, fire. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Folk, you got some breakdown for us there?
Yes, I was looking at the other category for our achieving a 3.7% differential. So in terms of other, so the other is the from the where your property taxes go slide was equal to about 2%, and so it is not those services that are listed here. So I'm just trying to make best do as I can here with the list of public facing services that we would not already be represented on the slide. Just give me one moment.
I'm sorry, Kevin. You know, Sasha, I assumed, because in my mind, Kevin had described the slide. That was actually my slide. I delivered that presentation, and that part of it. So of course, Kevin would be scrambling to figure out the answer. I apologize, Mr. Folk. Other includes things like our economic development services or our planning services. And services that aren't specifically listed there in this presentation format, but that are nonetheless part of services that residents rely on for in one way or another, directly or indirectly. You could think of our communications and engagement services like we are using tonight here as another example of what would be included in the other category. A full breakdown is in the budget document, and of course we can slice and dice these figures. Anyway, council needs to fully understand what the service we're delivering looks like. And in the rest of the operating document, there's some specific business plans that show in great detail what the service is designed, what it's built to produce, the service levels that we're intending to fulfill, and what recent activity level looks like. And in those examples, which provide much more detail than this slide, you see information that gives you a pretty clear picture of just what it is you're buying with the property taxes that are proposed in the plan. Apologize for the confusion, Sasha and Kevin.
Thanks.
And put you on the spot for enough, and I apologize.
No, and well, thanks, Ed. the number is a very small number. So it is 2% of the overall on that particular slide. If the slide I'm thinking of is the one that you've presented. And so it would be the smallest. And so let me just quote a couple of public facing services that I don't believe would be in the other categories. Economic development was its own 2% category. So a good example of other would be audit and operational review. So the Office of our Auditor General, a service called Intergovernmental Relations, which is really the composite of a number of either our executive efforts or some efforts of council in terms of managing our relationship with senior orders of government. I believe the museum service would be covered under one that's already there, legal and court services. And I believe the rest are summed into the other services that are in that graph. Again, I'm looking at pages 72 to page 75, which provides not a summary by department or division and organization of the city, but really provides a helpful way of looking at a budget defined by service categories. And so it will compensate for, and it will include the impacts of having certain distributed costs. So for instance, human resources or IT or costs that might be a part of a number of different services. And it seeks to put an estimate to a public-facing service category. And so it's another lens you can put on our budget. And we're looking to expand that lens in the 2024 budget as well. You'll see a lot more information about the direct costs and the indirect costs of a variety of our services and sub-services. And so I'd point you to that section in the binder, to the smallest of the totals in terms of net cost here for that 2%.
My apologies. I was on mute that time. Thank you both. Can you discuss the vacancy initiative to reduce staffing costs? How will this affect services? How will this affect the working employees? Will there be exceptions to the positions that can remain vacant?
Thank you for the questions. So the vacancy initiative, we're calling a vacancy management process, is really recognizing what naturally occurs in the organization when people change jobs, resign, or retire. Their position becomes vacant for a period of time. Normally, we go through a recruiting process, and as I described earlier, that's a 4 to 6 week process, depending on several factors that we don't necessarily control, like the job market. And that's been a significant issue for us in the last couple of years, particularly. With retirements increasing as people have reached the end of their careers, there seem to be fewer candidates for some roles. And some of our jobs are taking longer than 4 to 6 weeks to fill. So the effect that has, of course, is in some cases, cycle times for work is taking longer to complete. Things are taking longer to get completed. Responses may take longer to address inquiries. But the effect on other employees may be, in the short term, some shift in responsibilities. So there may be inquiries that we need to meet certain timelines for as a legislative requirement. And so we will reassign temporarily some resources to ensure that those timelines are sustained. And in the case of some examples, the positions simply can't be vacant for that long. And so, yes, I can anticipate there would be exceptions. And exceptions would be for those services where we have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation that require certain service levels to be met, and that can only be met with staff support. So think of our fire or paramedic services, think of our water and wastewater services, which are, again, rate-supported service and wouldn't be affected by the property tax decisions the council makes. But similarly, there are some services that have a 24/7 obligation. And in those instances, we would do our best to ensure that we are minimizing the time that the positions that are open stay open. So But the objective here, and again, subject to council's decision, is that there's roughly $3 million worth of staff time in the plan that we would instead create savings from by leaving positions open a little longer. And throughout the course of the year, there will be some service effects created by that. We'll do our best to monitor, well, we will not do our best, we will monitor where those vacancies are occurring. We'll describe on a regular basis through my quarterly presentations to council about the organization's performance, how we're seeing this work. And if we need to make adjustments through the year, then we will do so. But yes, I expect there will be some positions that, notwithstanding the standard we'll set for ourselves, will be filled as soon as possible because the service or the legislation we're following demands it. But thanks for asking.
Thank you. Next question. How much are we spending on roads with rising costs? Are we repairing the same amount as before?
So a question. For this, I'll ask for an assist from Mr. Chikuti, General Manager, Growth and Infrastructure, and person most responsible for coordinating our service efforts with respect to roads. Mr. Chikuti, over to you.
Well, I think the first question has been summarized in the budget binder. So how much we're spending this year, I think some other people can help me with that number. But the question in terms of, is a dollar going as far? I think obviously it's not. Inflation impacts road building and road maintenance as much as any other sector. In fact, in some cases more so. There was one of the slides I think Mr. Folk went through and in the presentation where we showed the cost of inflation and the impact to the maintenance budget for roads. So as an example, materials went up substantially, purchasing sand, gravel, salt, involved in maintenance, as well as building the roads. Those products are more expensive to purchase. So the same dollar can't build the same length of road that it could 10 years ago. And that's what inflation does. So the short answer to that is no, you can't do as much. But I think from a capital perspective, Kevin and I were just talking about this the other day. I think we're about 50 million in the capital, I believe, that's allocated for roads this year. And we did discuss this, Ed, and I think it's important for people that are listening here to understand when you look at our capital budget, because we're using a cash flow model, there's a tendency to look at 1 year capital and think that there's a significant drop year over year. And that cash flow model will have variations in spending, but the outlook now is more like on a 3 to 5 year outlook basis. So people that are interested would see there's an outlook forecast portion. So we may be allocating for one project 1 million this year, 3 million next year, and 5 million the year after. So the amount that we're allocating from the contributions from our operating budget have remained relatively steady. The amount we get in terms of steady contributions through an infrastructure fund from the provincial government has remained relatively steady. The amount we collect from user fees that we attribute to infrastructure building, like mostly water mains and sewer, from our water wastewater rates has remained fairly steady. The grant portion varies substantially. And if we use a bit of our allocation to borrow money, then our spending will go up substantially in that year as well. So, looking at this year might be a little bit deceiving, but looking at it over the past 5 years versus the previous 5, you'd get a better picture that we've substantially increased the spending on roads in the previous 5 years. And hopefully that's helpful to people that are listening and want to understand those details. Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Folk, I think you have something to add here.
And fully, so it was in the slide, but it was only a percentage. So fully a third, 33% of the 155 million or 50.6 million in roads for this year. And that's new approved projects and projects that are prior approved and continuing on to 2023.
And Sasha, if I could just add additionally, the other element that we may take for granted, and I mean, certainly at this season, we are all very highly aware of the winter control services, for example, that are part of our roads services that the municipality provides. And the repair work that goes on through the work that our linear infrastructure services group does is fully another $47 million worth of work every year. So our road network gets a lot of attention. Of course, a lot of attention from a councillor perspective as well, because residents are interested in improving our road conditions. But when you consider the totality of the spending that goes on to support our road network, it is a significant portion of both our capital and our operating costs every year. And as Tony noted, multi-year views are important when considering this infrastructure, because the expectation is that the investments we're making today in the network have a multi-year benefit attached to them. And so they accumulate over time, and that's how the condition improves. But the day-to-day service includes a lot of attention to our road network, like, for example, snow clearing, or we call winter control. Thanks.
All right, thank you. There currently are no questions in the queue, so I will put out a last call for questions, and we'll wait maybe just a minute to see if we have any further questions. All right, and seeing none, we will conclude the information session now. I will ask Mayor Lefebvre, Councillors Cormier and McIntosh to please share if you have anything to add before we close off.
Thank you, Sasha. I wanted to thank certainly the team for all the answers, and certainly the people that joined us tonight for all your questions. This was a great question, great information session. This will not be our last one. We have another one coming up, I believe, on February 6th. And certainly reach out to your counselors as well, and certainly to, which is important to kind of have your voices heard as to what your priorities are, and express them if you have any questions or concerns. There's a lot of information out there that you can access. So I really want to thank everyone for taking the time tonight, for your questions, and certainly for the team for all of the answers provided. And I look forward to the next session. Thank you. Councillor McIntosh, do you want to go from there?
I don't, just greatersudbury.ca/budget. Go in and take a look. I think it's a beautiful document, even if it is 624 pages long, but there's lots of pictures, and I really encourage the public to go out and look at the document, and also look at the questions and answers, the questions that the councillors are asking, and the answers that are provided, that are all there on the website. And thanks so much, everyone, for participating.
Thank you. Councillor Cormier?
Thank you. I'll just echo the thanks to the staff team that's here tonight, and especially the residents and others that have joined us for this information session. And I'm looking forward to the second one, and looking forward to the budget deliberations. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Archer, any final comments?
Thank you. No, simply to echo the appreciation everyone shared for both the work that went into planning this event, and for the participants who made some time available to learn a little more about how the municipality is planning to provide service this year, and what it will cost to do so. So thanks, Sasha, and appreciate your coordination as well.
All right. A reminder that we will be publishing your questions with the answers on our Over to You engagement platform in the coming days, and keeping the Q&A tool open on Over to You until February 15th. And the recording of tonight's session will also be available on the city's 2023 budget project page on overtoyou.greatersudbury.ca. Thank you for your time, and have a great evening.